Hello, and welcome to my multi-chapter series on covering and reading aloud Jan Lamprecht's book, Government by Deception: Psychopolitics in Southern Africa. I haven't read a book out loud like this for an audience in a long time. So the deeper I get into this book, the better it's going to be. And please forgive me and for any mispronunciations, and don't mock me. Some of these names in this book are just absolutely out there. These African and Russian names. So, I'm going to be trying to do one chapter every other day, and going from there. It's a lot of fun. I hope this is a book that everyone in the Western world and in Europe should listen to, especially all the whites in Africa. It's a warning to South Africans. Just in case you don't have the time to sit down and read this, here we go. I dedicate this to you guys. This book is dedicated to all the men and women of all races who fought and struggled so very bitterly against tremendous odds to prevent Southern Africa from becoming a Marxist hellhole. Some of you lost those dearest to you, or perhaps lost your limbs, or still bear the scars of the struggle. This book is in memory of everyone who opposed Marxism in their thoughts, with words, and above all who took up arms against this evil force. Nobody ever thanked you for your efforts, but I will. I want to let you know that while most of this world has forgotten you, there are some like me who never will. I am certain that God smiled upon your efforts. Now on to the acknowledgments. I would like to thank the people who helped me. Sadly, I discovered how fragmented anti-communists in South Africa are and how territorial some people were. Some people whom I had expected to be my friends and allies disappointed me greatly. In the course of my research and writing, it became obvious to me how successful the communists have been in maintaining unity, while those opposed to them have little idea of how to cooperate and together in unity, and work together in unity. Disunity among conservatives did not come as a surprise to me. What came as a surprise was to see how selfish and arrogant certain people are and how unwilling they are to do anything except on their own terms. There is a great spirit of sharing and cooperation amongst conservatives than among those who oppose them. In this miserable scenario, the cooperation of some people stood out like a searchlight on the dark night. In this miserable scenario, the cooperation of some people stood out like a searchlight on a dark night. I would like to thank the following people in alphabetical order for their help, suggestions, and input. Gordon Frisch, American journalist and geopolitical analyst. Dr. Chris Jordan, ex-military intelligence. Anthony Lebedo, American journalist. Dr. Stoffel Kruger, ex-South African Defense Force officer. Mike Mott. Jeff Nyquist, American journalist and geopolitical analyst. John Redfern, Rhodesia Association of South Africa. Jeff Rentz, American talk radio host. Dave Sherry, Adriana Stoit, Dutch journalist. Joan Wilcox, and Julie Van Rensburg. There were, of course, some who did not want their names to be mentioned because their careers might be threatened. I cannot mention everyone's name, especially the names of black people who really helped me tremendously because I fear for their lives. I would like to single out those who made special efforts over and above the call of duty. This first is Dr. Chris Jordan, who gave so freely of his time and tremendous knowledge. He took so much interest in guiding me. He spared no effort in assisting me and is one of the finest people I have ever met in my life. Marge Leitner was always helping me and spurring me on. Some of Marge's contacts gave me excellent information for which I was very grateful. I received a tremendous amount of support from American radio talk show host Jeff Rentz. He not only contributed to the book, but was kind enough to interview me months before the book was completed so that I could have a chance to discuss Southern African issues with an American audience. Words cannot express the deep gratitude I have for Jeff Rentz. Both Anthony Lebedo and Adriana Stoit are great friends of South Africa who work very hard at spreading the news of the deteriorating situation in South Africa overseas. I would finally like to thank Jeff Nyquist for writing the foreword of this book. Jeff is someone whom I have great respect for. Jeff is a dedicated anti-communist crusader. Jeff is unquestionably one of the most intelligent people I've ever met in my life. To me, Jeff represents the epitome of brave, intelligent, and dedicated people who fight communism without giving any quarter. In this sad world of ours, I have been privileged to meet some very fine people. All the names mentioned above fall into that category. It is people like these who make life worth living. Then I'm going to skip the part where it says contacting the author. I wonder if that's even accessible anymore 22 years later. Here's the foreword by Jeff Nyquist. The Western world needs to know that Marxism has got the upper hand in sub-Saharan Africa. After many blunders, after losing adherence to African native socialism, the Marxist-Leninists of the continent have finally built themselves a strong position in Angola, South Africa, Congo, Zimbabwe, and elsewhere. Although the communists remain a minority in the countries they dominate, their tactics of control and manipulation have served them well. They have avoided adventurism, wearing the mask of moderation, but soon enough the world will see how Marxism and racism on the side of Black Africa will soon produce a humanitarian catastrophe, and they will recognize that Moscow, Havana, and Beijing continue to play an active role in this process. In the early 1950s, the communist presence in Africa was negligible. Only the South African Communist Party, SACP, allied with the African National Congress, the ANC, had a substantial membership. Sudan might also be listed as having a communist presence. With a party membership of around 7,000, Moscow and Beijing did not think much about Africa. In strategic terms, it was a peripheral interest. In 1954, however, Moscow began to take notice of Africa. Marxist-Leninist analysts began to study Africa and ask themselves what uses that continent could be put to. Without any experience of Africa, the Russians had to start from scratch. Their first opportunity to dirty their hands came in March 1957 when the Gold Coast, now Ghana, became the first black African country granted independence by Great Britain. No sooner did this occur than Moscow announced the publication of a series of books on the national liberation movement in Africa. It should not surprise us if the KGB quickly brought Ghana under control, but Africa being what it is, anarchic and unsteady, the KGB lost control completely. This was the story in many African countries. Oh, that's a typo right there. The Russians would make converts, develop agents, but would lose out to native feeling, tribal patterns of thought and behavior. The Russians at first hurt their chances by taking a much too rigid ideological approach to sub-Saharan Africa. The picture of the early years of Soviet involvement in Africa has been painted for us by KGB veteran and Soviet functionary Ilya Zurkvelov, who began working for TASS, in September 1965. Zurkvelov's account given in his book Secret Servant shows how common sense was overridden by rigid Marxism, and the more sophisticated Russian observers understood what needed to be done. The Africans needed room to discover themselves and explore their own ideas of socialism. After Zurkvelov became an editor of the Sub-Saharan African desk at TASS, he was sent to Africa and saw things firsthand. The point of view that Soviet journalists took toward Black Africa was dictated by the International Department of the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party. It wasn't a matter of independent journalism. It was a war for control of the continent. According to Zurkvelov, 2/3 of Soviet journalists serving in Africa during the 1960s were KGB and GRU agents. He was himself a former KGB officer sent to Zanzibar in 1965 as a journalist. Zanzibar was the so-called gateway to East Africa. In 1965, the International Department was thinking that Zanzibar would become a second Cuba. Comrade Manchka, head of the Africa sub-department, noted at the time that in Zanzibar, our aim is to show the other countries of Africa through this example of Zanzibar the political and economic success that can be achieved by a country that takes the socialist path of development. And, of course, Zanzibar's strategic position is also not without importance for us. Of course, Zanzibar's strategic importance as a gateway country was Moscow's real bottom line. Setting aside all socialist propaganda, the Russians wanted to set up a supply base on the island, located 22 miles off the east coast of Africa. In 1964, the year previous, Zanzibar and Pemba Island had joined with Tanganyika on the mainland to form the country of Tanzania. The mentality of the native ruling groups was definitely socialist in the political organization, to the extent that serious organization was possible, mimicked aspects of the Soviet model. The experiment of self-rule was new, and the Russians hoped to impress their model on the Africans. They also hoped to gain military bases. In spite of the importance attached to Zanzibar, wrote Zerkvilov, I was skeptical about its real value politically. In other words, such talk about Africa had to be Soviet propaganda. How could the Kremlin care about Africa? Of what value could it be? Even the Europeans didn't want it any longer. Zerkvilov, who later defected to the West, thought Zanzibar was militarily worthless. He thought the people were too backwards and to be useful for anything. He concluded that Soviet officials posted to Zanzibar would be free to ignore the latest ideological nonsense from Moscow. Being in such a place, he imagined, would give him a break from subversive and revolutionary activity. Who really cared about Africa? Zanzibar would be a wonderful place to escape what Zerkvilov called Soviet reality. But he later admitted, in this I was mistaken. The Soviet leaders really did attach a great importance to the African continent and were determined to win it over politically. According to Zerkvilov, the Kremlin recognized a golden opportunity for socialism in Africa due to the retreat of the European colonial powers. The newly emerging African leaders were almost entirely hostile to the West. The Kremlin therefore believed, and for good reason, that Africa could easily become a zone of Soviet influence. This, in fact, was clearly stated by the head of the International Department, Mikhail Suslov, at a meeting at the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union attended by Zerkvilov. The object of winning over Africa was not simply to spread socialism on the Soviet model, but also to obtain an absolute majority of votes in the United Nations organization, of which the new African countries had become members, wrote Zerkvilov. Okay, where was I? There I was. Later, Suslov would complain that the African and other developing countries were dominating the United Nations and were attempting to dictate terms to the United States and the Soviet Union. The USSR poured billions of rubles into Africa. They sent military and economic advisors to increase the military power of the African countries and guide African countries to intimidate the Soviet model, imitate the Soviet model. But African socialism had a natural course of its own, with the folkways of Africa to consider. This was foolishly ignored by Soviet advisors in many instances. The African leaders were at first pleased with Soviet military aid, but the economic advice they were given led to decline and disintegration rather than to growth, wrote Zerkvilov, who was one of those who informed Moscow that the program was headed for disaster. Zerkvilov and other Soviet operatives in Africa were told that the failed economic experiments did not matter. The waste and loss involved was of no consequences to the Kremlin. The task that faced us, wrote Zerkvilov, was not simply to provide the countries of Africa with economic aid, but primarily to turn them into countries following the path of socialism and totally rejecting capitalism, in the Soviet model, of course. To do that, we had to create a working class, which could not be done without creating an industry. Failure piled upon failure piled up. The result of Russia's policy was that Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia broke with the Soviet Union. The Africans quickly learned that the Russians could not deliver on their promises, and that their second-rate weapons came with unacceptable strings attached. In their efforts to convince the semi-literate African leaders, Soviet diplomats would tell them that before the revolution of 1917, Russia was at the same level of development as the countries of Africa, wrote Zerkvilov. But this was ridiculous. Before 1917, Russia had produced some of the world's leading writers, composers, and thinkers. Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Tchaikovsky, etc. The unthinking rigidity of Soviet diplomats and the corruption of African leaders meant that Zanzibar would never become a Soviet island fortress at the gateway of East Africa. Russia's first attempt in Africa ended in dismal failure, but it was far from their last. When Portugal suffered a military coup in 1974, communist agents entered the government. Portugal's African colonies, Mozambique and Angola, broke away under communist auspices. Moscow immediately sent tens of millions in support of the Angolan communists, and they sent communist troops to Cuba, or from Cuba. Finally, an outright Marxist-Leninist regime was established in Angola. It was the first of several to be formed. The Russians had finally established a beachhead in Africa. Using Asian, excuse me, let me take a drink here. Using agents of influence to apply pressure and African troops to harass the white-ruled zones of Rhodesia and South Africa, the communists exploited African racial resentments against European colonizers, playing an even lighter role themselves, employing black Cuban troops and advisors to strengthen the Africans. The Russian-supported communists directly engaged in the South Africans along racial lines. Battlefield defeats in this war of attrition were meaningless for the communists, just as Rhodesia was progressively squeezed out by playing the race card on the world arena. This same strategy was also applied successfully in South Africa. Finally, the whites buckled, and the blacks who came to power in Rhodesia and South Africa had, surprise, surprise, communist credentials. The many blacks who consider themselves socialists without being Marxist-Leninists may not understand how dangerous their Moscow or Beijing-supported brethren really are. And those in America and the West understand nothing at all about the real agenda of major players within the now ruling African National Congress, the ANC, and South African Communist Party, SACP. The fact is, Africa's most powerful country is now closely allied with the likes of Fidel Castro, Vladimir Putin, and Jiang Zemin. It is an anti-American alliance which is also anti-Western and virtually so. The vital mineral wealth of Africa was the prize that the communists had in mind all along. Together with the vast mineral storehouse of Russia itself, the resentful Eastern Bloc alliance now begins to tighten the metals market, which we have seen Russia doing for the past 2 years. One only has to look at the price of palladium and other platinum group metals to see that something odd is beginning to happen. All of this is intimately bound up with the fate of sub-Saharan Africa. The Western world ought to read Jan Lamprecht's book, which uncovers evidence, vital proof, that the Cold War never ended. Africa remains a battlefield to this day. The communists are struggling to subdue black Africa after first subduing the whites in alliance with the blacks. The next step will be to use Africa, one day, against the West, which foolishly abandoned white rule in South Africa and Rhodesia to the benefit of international communism. And that was Jeff Nyquist on the foreword and the intro to the book. And now the introduction. Africa is potentially the richest continent on Earth. The most developed and richest segment of that continent is Southern Africa, but Africa is doomed. People outside Africa have a simplistic and romanticized idea of this continent, which has little bearing on reality, but this is changing. I have noticed that in recent years, people in Europe and America are starting to have second thoughts about providing aid to Africa. These first world nations have given freely and generously from the heart. They are starting to wonder why this is not paying off. They are wondering why Africa is hardly moving forward and what is happening to the billions of dollars in aid which they have provided for so long. They are realizing that Africa is a bottomless pit. This continent just does not seem to be able to get its act together. Nobody knows how to fix Africa, not even the leaders of its top nations. Or let me put it in another way.
If anybody out there knows how to fix Africa, then it must be indeed, indeed, be the world's best kept secret. The word Afro-pessimism can be coined to describe how foreigners feel about this continent. I left the country of Zimbabwe, which was obviously formerly Rhodesia, in 1981 and moved to South Africa. I was young, I had no skills and no money. The only place I could go to was South Africa, so I moved there. In the ensuing years, most of our family moved to South Africa. Adjusting was not always easy, and South Africans looked down on us. We were considered to be losers. White South Africans told us that blacks would never rule South Africa. We disagreed. We knew more about Marxism than most of them and believed that no matter how materially strong they were, it was just a matter of time before they would cave in to world pressure. I was often homesick. By 1984 to 85, there was serious trouble brewing in South Africa. Then some people said that life in Zimbabwe was actually not so bad, and there were some whites who were going back there. Finally, I decided to go and take a look for myself. I took a month's leave and flew up there. Harare was still very clean, and a lot of memories came flooding back. But as we visited people and saw how things really worked, we began to realize just how much the country had indeed degenerated. We heard stories about Mugabe and other top people in the country and how they did as they pleased. They were above the law. They could have people shot in broad daylight, and nobody would hear about it. No, not one word of these things left the country. Mugabe's spies were everywhere, and you could trust no one. Bit by bit, I realized that this was not the same country I had left 5 years before. Now I longed to go back to South Africa. Suddenly, I cut my holiday short and returned home. I had only spent 2 weeks in Zimbabwe, but that cured me, for once and for all, of my homesickness, and I have never returned there since. Now South Africa is my home, and no matter what its problems may be, it is a far sight better than Robert Mugabe's hell on earth. The sad fact, though, is that South Africa is now racing towards becoming a similar hell. I'm not alone in thinking this. All those of us who left Zimbabwe and live here have seen it coming for years. Many of those white South Africans who called us losers back then are now saying that South Africa is going the same way as Zimbabwe. The white tribe of Africa, the last remnants of colonialism, are all starting to agree that the writing is on the wall. Too bad so many did not see it coming earlier. During my 2-week stay in Zimbabwe, I came as close to Robert Mugabe as I ever will. It happened one day when I was driving through Harare with my mother during the lunchtime rush hour. I was about to turn into Samoa Michelle Avenue when the robot turned red. I heard several police sirens approaching. Approaching on my right were several black policemen on motorbikes. I wondered what was going on. The light was now green, and I wanted to drive on. My mother, who had remained in Zimbabwe for 2 years after I had left, immediately admonished me to keep the car perfectly still or we would be shot. I was infuriated, but then I noticed that all the motor vehicles at this intersection remained perfectly still as well. The police motorbikes then blocked off the intersection while other police raced through onto the next robot. Notice how the South Africans or Rhodesians called the traffic lights robots. Interesting. Suddenly, a black motor car containing Robert Mugabe whizzed past us. Immediately following him was an army truck containing about 20 soldiers armed with rifles. As soon as the police motorbikes were gone, the traffic continued as normal. Until that moment, I had never known this was Mugabe's way of traveling around Zimbabwe. My mother had never mentioned it to me. I did not think much of a ruler who could drive around and disrupt traffic as he pleased. I thought it was downright dangerous. Here he was racing through the center of a busy city at 120 kilometers an hour, not stopping for a single traffic light, and people just had to get out of the way. Did the man think he was God? This was a far cry from Ian Smith, the last white prime minister of Rhodesia, who got on a bicycle and pedaled off to his office in order to set an example to people to save fuel. I mentioned this incident to other Zimbabweans I met during the short holiday. They began recounting stories of what had happened to people they knew. They told me when Mugabe drove to another city, he would drive in the center of the main road. The main roads in Zimbabwe were mostly two-lane, tarred roads. Mugabe would drive in the middle at his usual breakneck speeds. Cars, trucks, and buses would just have to dive off both lanes and make way for him. And if you did not get out of the way, you would be shot dead. I was told of an incident on a bridge near the Little village of Rua. I had grown up in Rua. It lies 20 kilometers outside Harare on the main road going east. I was told how a Portuguese man had been driving across the bridge when Mugabe was coming the other way. He could not get off the bridge and was shot dead on the spot. I was told of a white woman who was shot dead in the center of Harare. She had not gone out of the way quickly enough, and so they shot her. These were the these were the kinds of stories I heard from people whom we had known for many years when we still lived in that country. I never spent time attempting to verify these stories, but I'm sure they were true for two reasons. One was that we had known these people for a great many years and were often in touch with them. Secondly, we heard the same stories from others who had lived in the same area. None of these stories had been communicated to us by phone or by letter. They were told to us in person when we visited there. Everyone feared Mugabe's spies, and when we generally believed they were opening everyone's mail. Many years later, I became friends with an American geopolitical analyst by the name of Jeff Nyquist. I told him the story of how Mugabe traveling around the country. Jeff told me how this was how the leaders of the old Soviet Union travel around. This was just one more of so many confirmations that Mugabe was a closet communist. My father had a small dairy farm in Rua. That's where I had spent most of my youth. The first school I had gone to was Rua Primary. In later years, the little school was moved and renamed. It made international news in 1994 when it was claimed that several young children had seen a UFO land there. The children claimed to have seen beings get out of the craft. The craft had landed by an electricity pylon. The teachers had vouched for the honesty of the children. Miss Dutoy had been our music teacher at the time of the little school. She had long black hair. In later years, after Mugabe took over, her husband was busy repairing a fence on his farm when some blacks came and beat him up. They tied him up with barbed wire and left him lying there. They went to the house and dragged Miss Dutoy out by her hair. Then they set the house on fire. During the 1986 trip, I heard something else which was very disturbing and which hinted at what may come in the future. We visited some old friends on their beautiful farm. Clearly they were still living well, but even so they lived in fear. They told us they believed one of Mugabe's ministers had taken a liking to their splendid farm. One day a fancy car had driven up with blacks in it. They said that an important personage wanted to buy the farm. The white farmer said the farm was not for sale at any price. The blacks then said something to the effect that he would be sorry. Sometime later, one of the farmer's prized game animals was found shot dead near the main road. He believed this had been done to try and intimidate him. In the capital city of Harare, we heard how whites were being discriminated against. As often happened in Zimbabwe, there was often one or the other shortage. We were told how a white person would go to the store intending to buy some bread. On arrival there, the person would be told that they were out of stock. But if that same person were to send a servant to buy the bread, they would be given bread. We then heard from several white people how they used their servants to do their shopping for them because of the discrimination. I observed in Zimbabwe how whites had to use blacks to deal with other blacks in all manners of matters, or else they would be discriminated against. Whites learned not to anger the blacks. No matter what the blacks did, the whites just had to keep their cool. Temper tantrums would only get them into bigger trouble. I'm afraid I'm far too outspoken to grovel on my knees like that for the rest of my life. I found it quite amazing that the whites who had chosen to work with the Marxists were themselves so badly treated. They had to put up with all manner of insults, which I would never have stood for. They were constantly being walked on, and they knew their place. Politics was for the blacks, and the whites knew that they had to keep their mouths shut. Another story we heard was of a white farmer who went into a farmer's co-op in Guerrero, whatever. The farmer was told that the item he wanted was not available. On hearing this, he burst out saying, "Can't get any bloody thing in this country anymore." Someone reported this to the police, and a few minutes later, the police were there questioning him about this incident. Whites have to know their place. My mother had left some money in Barclays Bank in Harare when she left the country. It was several $100s. We intended withdrawing it, closing the account, and then spending the money before returning to South Africa. We spent an entire day in the bank, and nobody could locate the account nor the money. We just gave up and left in disgust. I walked through the streets of Harare. The shops had little in them. Even during the Rhodesian Bush War and during sanctions, the stores had never been this bare. I was amazed at how the prices of everything had increased in the few years since we had left. My parents had owned a cozy little house in Samora Machel Avenue in the final days of our stay there. My mother had sold it for 10,000 Zimbabwe dollars. We were then told that now, a mere 5 years later, the same house was worth a staggering 75,000 Zimbabwe dollars. The Zimbabwe dollar had fallen a great deal. The whites there referred to it as monopoly money. They regarded the U.S. dollars, British pounds, or even South African rands as real money. I was amazed at this economic stagnation of Zimbabwe. There was empty shops everywhere. They often laid out their items so as to take up as much space as possible. Otherwise, most of the shelves would have been empty. Garages, which previously had lots of second-hand cars for sale, were now standing completely empty. Marxism was ruining this once vibrant country. Now I longed to return to South Africa. Thus I cut my ties with the land of my birth. I was never homesick ever again, and I never returned to it either. Mugabe had ruined it. It's amazing when I think back to the life in Rhodesia before Mugabe took over. I remember how family and friends were horrified by the economic collapse of firstly Zambia and later Mozambique. When Mozambique collapsed, the Portuguese people were there left all their belongings behind and fled into Rhodesia overnight. They lost everything they had. The blacks Marxists got everything, and yet by the 1990s, Mozambique was officially the poorest nation in the world. Go figure. We whites used to look at Zambia, and we would hear of how it was falling apart under its incompetent rulers. The government there was very friendly with communist China, and we heard how tractors or Mercedes-Benz motor vehicles had been donated to them by well-meaning Western nations, and how these fine vehicles broke down and just stood there rusting. Oh, maybe the only fault with this vehicle was a spark plug that was no longer functioning, but nobody would know how to fix it. So the vehicles or tractors would just stand there and rust into oblivion. How we wished we would lay our hands on that equipment because we knew how to get it working again. Sometimes the United Nations or some other donor would drop off food in a neighboring country, and later we would hear that it was being sold openly instead of being given to those it was intended for. We used to marvel at how much aid black countries got while Rhodesians were under comprehensive world sanctions. We had to repair things over and over again and keep things running which people in other parts of the world would have thrown away long ago. I can relate to that struggle. Any new vehicle we smuggled into our country was a marvel. If we went on holiday to South Africa and South Africans could tell the Rhodesians by our old motor cars, since we were under sanctions, there were few cars available, and it depended on what clandestine deal someone could strike. The blacks in neighboring states could buy as much oil as they wanted, while British Navy was patrolling the Indian Ocean, intercepting any oil tankers that might have oil for Rhodesia. Eventually, our only source for oil was South Africa. The South Africans could cut it off and well if they wanted to, but pressure on our the South Africans could cut it off at will if they wanted to put pressure on our country. We were allocated only X number of liters of fuel each month. If we farmed, we were given extra fuel for tractors, and that was all we could use. We formed lift clubs to save fuel. Our Prime Minister Ian Smith often had to negotiate political deals with Marxist trash like Mugabe while a gun was held to his head. He could put under pressure from South Africa and America, which went something like this. Your country only has X number of days of fuel, and given the current war situation, your country will collapse in Y number of days. So here's the deal. We want you to sign, or we will pull the rug out from underneath your feet. The word on everyone's lips in Rhodesia in those days was, we mustn't become another Zambia. Now, almost 30 years later, I am in South Africa, and people are saying we mustn't become another Zimbabwe. In 1994, I watched as blacks in South Africa were dancing in the streets. Freedom at last! The world was happy for South Africa. Black and white politicians alike told the world and us what a great future lay ahead for South Africa. I watched all this rather unmoved. I had seen this before in Zimbabwe. I had long said, as many others did, that South Africa was going to end up like Zimbabwe. It too would be ruined. Of what use is democracy and freedom when the rulers are Marxist? Their faulty policies will ruin things anyway. I looked at the blacks sadly. They had only exchanged one form of oppression for another. For them, very little would change. People might fall off their chairs when they read this, but I have long believed that one day the blacks would look back on apartheid and actually say that life was better back then. Now, 7 years later, some people in South Africa are starting to question the wisdom of handing the country over to Marxists. Now, those same whites that had said blacks would never rule the country are saying, we are going the same way as Zimbabwe. Most stunning has been the change in attitude of the white liberals. Invariably, rich white South Africans were liberal. They disliked apartheid and did all they could to hand this country over to ANC. Previously, these people had wined and dined the Marxists and given them money and support. Nowadays, you could hardly tell a white liberal from a white conservative because they are saying all the same things. White liberals are now very vocal in their criticism of the ANC. This disillusionment with the ANC is something some of us saw coming for a long time ago. The general change in the world's attitude towards Africa is a hopeful sign. Finally, the West is starting to see Africa the way it really is. I wrote this book in order to get something off my chest, which has been bothering me for a very long time. I want people outside the African continent to be aware of the main reason for Africa's failure. I want people to be aware that the continent has taken a wrong turn, and if things are not changed, then this continent is doomed to enter the Dark Ages and to remain there for an extremely long time. It is time for that someone dared to stand up and say things in a plain, simple, and straightforward manner. The politicians in this part of the world are hiding many secrets. They do not want the Western world to know who they really are and what they really stand for. What you are about to read are the observations of a white South African who has spent his entire life on this continent. In 1994, the world thought that South Africa's race and poverty problems had finally been solved. Some even hinted that Africa's problems were going to be solved since the last pesky white men had been put in their place. Personally, I'm not so sure. There are quite a few of us who believe that the problems have in fact just started. The Marxists here will simply take the old problems and make them worse. There are some of us here in Africa who believe the worst is yet to come. That was Jan Lamprecht in Johannesburg, South Africa, in March of 2001. And that was the introduction.
And now we're on to the last part of the introduction, which is the introduction for the ebook. In 2001, I published Government by Deception at my own cost in order to avoid having an editor force me to remove or change the text in any way. I'm glad that I did. The mass media avoided the book like the plague. The Star newspaper in Johannesburg refused to even do a book review on it because they said it was too provocative. I was not allowed to even appear on radio today in Johannesburg for a book review paid for by the owner of a mail-order bookstore. The only radio station in South Africa which ever did anything close to a decent interview with me was Radio Pretoria back in '01. I have given up on getting a decent hearing via the mass media and am quite content to continue spreading my message via the internet and via independent radio stations in the USA. The Zimbabwe crisis, which started in 2000, has resulted in a plethora of books being written by those of us who have come from there. Most of us have no outlets to the rest of the world.
except those which we created. I used to be unhappy about this, but I am no longer concerned. The internet is the only place where you can have any chance of free speech. The growth of internet ensures that it is the wave of the future as far as information and also disinformation is concerned. I think those of us from Africa must not be too worried about the fact that we have been ignored and sidelined by the powers that be, because in due of course we are going to have a worldwide effect, whether they like it or not, regardless of how long it takes us. In many ways it is good because it forces us to stand on our own 2 feet. In 2000, we were like a baby learning to walk. We needed someone else's help, but it won't be long before we don't need anybody. We will organize ourselves, we will help each other, and we will stick together and fight together if need be. Among the many experiments I have engaged in since I originally published this book was to experiment with ebooks. The first ebook that anyone wrote at my suggestion was Without Honor by Rob Ellis, who went to school with me. Rob wrote about his first-hand experiences as Mugabe was busy murdering the Matabele people in the 1980s. I want to continue encouraging people to write ebooks. This is a way whereby we can save for prosperity our experiences and enlighten future generations about what really happened and why it happened. It appears to me that Government by Deception is probably the book which contains more successful predictions than any other which has been written in South Africa in recent history. Liberals, including Tony Leon, the leader of the official opposition in Parliament, attacked me over what I had wrote in this book. However, this book has stood its ground. That's a typo. Many things herein which were never discussed before have gone to permeate the consciousness of whites in South Africa. For example, I'm sure I'm the first person to have discussed crime as a low-intensity racial war being waged against whites in South Africa. Many people now agree with this viewpoint. I also predicted that the South African government would support Mugabe. South Africa has in recent years signed a military alliance with Zimbabwe. In the chapter, The Marxist Brotherhood, I predicted that Mugabe, along with his allies in South Africa, would try to spread their evil among other black leaders in Africa. The world was completely shocked when in early 2007, the 14 African countries making up the SADC together agreed to support Robert Mugabe in his war against the West and against neo-colonialism. I said, too, that black people in South Africa would be worse off than they were under apartheid. The Institute of Race Relations issued a report in recent years saying that poverty among the poorest of blacks had doubled since 1994. At the time of writing, I'm busy rewriting my African Crisis website. Currently, it is at this website. However, I intend on reinstating it to thecurrentafricancrisis.org in the next year. One of my recent readers said even in 2007, government by deception is uncannily current. That pleased me. I had said to people in the early days of my book that this book would have a long life. This was not just another political book. This book's full value has yet to be realized. I may consider writing a follow-up book after 2010. In the book, I mentioned the idea of whites in South Africa seizing their own territory in the Cape, and if a future race war should occur here. In 2006, I did a tentative exercise showing the smallest homeland that contained a city and an international airport and harbor, which was very easily defensible. You could find this article here, link there. The only major thing missing from my analysis when I wrote this book in 2001 was the intervention of the CIA in ending apartheid and in bringing an end to white rule in both Rhodesia and South Africa. I was not aware of how liberals who came to dominate the CIA thought. I learned about this when an intelligence friend pointed me to a fascinating book written by Dr. Richard Cummings in the USA. He had also worked in the CIA in the Middle East, but prior to that, he had written a book about Allard Lowenstein called The Pied Piper. In it, he told the story of the CIA's activities in southern Africa. In 1995, Dr. Cummings wrote about it in the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. The article is called A Diamond is Forever. Mandela Triumphs, Buthelezi and de Klerk survive, and ANC on the U.S. payroll. You can read this whole article here. I also summarized explained the logic in a series of newsletters I wrote called Straight Talk, which are in African Crisis bookstore. Dr. Cummings explained the logic of the CIA in his book, The Pied Piper. In short, the CIA supported apartheid for as long as there was the threat of the Soviet communism, but when the Soviet Union collapsed, the CIA felt it was safe to end apartheid and to install the black ANC. Robert Mugabe may be a liar much of the time, but one thing he is right. He says that there is neo-colonialism. What Robert Mugabe describes is exactly what Dr. Cummings discusses as a CIA strategy. In essence, the CIA and U.S. government helped these black liberation movements to power so they could then control them and pull their strings from behind the scenes. The CIA's strategy was to take these openly Marxist and communist organizations and to then try to hijack them and turn them into liberal capitalist organizations by twisting their arms. They do this by using diplomacy and using financial aid from the West. You will notice the explosion of super wealthy black ANC capitalists like Tokyo Sexuale and Cyril Ramaphosa, for example, and yet underneath it, they're really Marxists. Robert Mugabe is stinking rich, as was other famous communists. Wealth does not rid them of their Marxist beliefs as the CIA thinks. So if we look back on the history of the liberation of Africa, we see the white colonials were usurped by black Marxist liberation movements, which the American and British governments then tried to control via neo-colonialism. The events of 2000 in Zimbabwe were the beginnings of the second liberation of Africa. This time to throw off the yoke of Western liberalism, the blacks want to become socialist as per the original intentions decades ago. Robert Mugabe and the ANC must carry on with this plan because they are alienating the last friends they have in the world. They are alienating the hand that feeds them. Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe and the South African government are reverting to being what we said they were all along, black Marxists. Recently in the USA, Professor Kirchik, a highly respected liberal, has launched ferocious attacks on Mugabe in Zimbabwe as well as on South African government for their policies. It appears to me we are seeing the beginning of the end of the honeymoon between the Western liberals and the black Marxist terrorists of Africa. South Africa is a very important country to the Western world. Africa is the Western world's playground. As liberal as the West is, it is not going to be charmed with the path Mugabe has embarked on. Mugabe can spread his hatred of the West in Africa. Mugabe can continue with his racist agenda, but he is looking for trouble. I do not believe that we whites from Africa, both those in Africa and those who left, should give up. In this book, I wrote about a hypothetical race war, which I refer to as the whites' last stand. Rest assured of two things. Firstly, the last battle for South Africa has yet to occur. Secondly, things will get a lot worse before they get better. But I must tell you that I am much happier in 2007 than I was in 2001. When I first wrote this book, back then I feared that we would be destroyed and nobody would notice. Thanks to so many of us going on an information offensive of our own accord, we have actually raised the alarm to such a degree that this will not be so easy for our enemies to pull off. A former major in the Rhodesian army asked me one day what I thought the future held for Zimbabwe. I told him that I thought things would simmer and burn there for a long time, but that a civil war there was possible. I also think things may get even worse there once Mugabe is gone. I see no hope for the MDC opposition as it stands currently. The MDC really have to wake up if they are to have any hope. For them, war is the only hope. I remain confident that the problems which Mugabe started in 2000 still have a long time to go to play themselves out. It is possible that Mugabe's communist racist nonsense may ultimately lead to one or more future wars in southern Africa. I hope that happens because I always thought that the proper response to what he did to the farmers and to the country since 2000 was to destroy his regime completely through war and nothing less, and anyone who supports him deserves the same fate. That's Jan Lamprecht, Johannesburg, South Africa, in September of 2007. And the rest of the intro is a glossary of abbreviations and other things. And next we are going to jump into part 1, chapter 1, that's labeled Goodbye Colonialism.